In the last few videos, you would have seen interesting topics with respect to Kubernetes, and most of you have been requesting me to create videos on Spring Cloud Kubernetes, and here we go. This is the first video in the Spring Cloud Kubernetes series. As a start, we are going to see the lightweight Spring Cloud Kubernetes integration using ConfigMaps. We will look at what is ConfigMap inside Kubernetes, and then we will see how we can leverage the Spring Cloud Kubernetes library to use it with our Spring Boot application. Let's get started.
Press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss any update from Tech Primers.
Simply put, it is basically a library to connect with native Kubernetes services from your Spring Boot applications. This is just the documentation of Spring Cloud Kubernetes. There are different features which Spring Cloud Kubernetes provides. For example, the service discovery framework, the ribbon load balancing, and also the config maps, basically loading configurations dynamically, which is a similar concept of a config server. So we are going to take a look at the config server part with Kubernetes config maps. So what is a config map inside Kubernetes? Config maps are basically configurations which you can create inside Kubernetes. For example, key value pairs or property files, which you can maintain inside the Kubernetes infrastructure within your specific cluster, and you can load that into your deployments or your containers. You can load that into your containers and use it like any other property file. If I need to give an example of a config map, a simple example would be application properties which are specific to your environments. For example, I have a different specific property file for my dev, test, and prod. And most of the time what happens, since all these properties are together within your application, there is a risk that you can load anything by just setting your profile. However, using config servers or config maps in case of Kubernetes, you can get rid of this problem by creating the property files specific to your environment in that particular cluster and leverage your application to directly load these properties from the Kubernetes platform. That's what config maps are. I'll show you the configuration in a bit once we get started with the hands-on part. So what config server used to do in the Spring Boot world with Spring Config Server, Kubernetes provides the config map. Now, Spring being Spring, they have created a library to connect all these native services inside the Kubernetes platform to provide seamless support for your Spring Boot applications to create cloud native application inside Kubernetes. And that's where Spring Cloud Kubernetes helps us in achieving that. And the first one which we are going to see here is the Kubernetes config. With our usual style, let's get started by creating a new project from scratch, and then I'll explain you what are the different things you need to know as and when we start doing it. So I'm going to create my project name as comtechprimers.kubernetes. Since this is based on the Kubernetes config, I'm going to call this as Spring Cloud Kubernetes config example. The dependencies which I would require are the Spring Web or the Spring MVC, and also I need the actuators, because using the actuator I can expose a refresh endpoint, and then I'm going to refresh my config server without even restarting my application, and I'm going to show that. So let me create this project and open it in IntelliJ. So the project is loaded in IntelliJ right now. This is a vanilla Spring Boot project. There is nothing fancy in here. So I'll just expand it so that we know what is inside. It's all empty. Let's go to the first part. This is a plain project, so we need to add our dependency for the Kubernetes config. So I already have the Kubernetes config added into my IntelliJ as a live template. So I just triggering my live template so that it automatically generates the code. And what I add here is my Spring Cloud Starter Kubernetes config dependency, and I'm using the 1.1.0 release version, which is the latest version of the Spring Cloud Kubernetes library. Also, I'm using the latest Spring Boot version 2.2.1. For the example, I'm going to use my Docker desktop, which is running on version 19.03.4, and also I'm going to use my Minikube, which is 1.5.2. Also, I have my Kubernetes platform, which is 1.16. So these are the different versions which I'm going to use to show you the example. Also, of course, I'm using the scaffold version 1.0. Coming back to IntelliJ, once the dependencies are set, we now have the Kubernetes config injected into our project. Now to use these, I need to add some code. So let's add some configuration to the example. I'm going to call this as welcome configuration. I want this to be loaded during the startup, so I'll add auto configuration annotation. Also, I want to load my configuration from a predefined prefix, and the prefix is called welcome. So I have some predefined set of parameters which are going to be loaded with prefix. I have the first one, which is the message, which is nothing but the welcome message. Now I'm going to hardcode this with a default welcome message, which is welcome to Tech Primers. And I'm going to generate some getters and setters. If you're using Lombok, you don't have to do that. I'm not using Lombok. So I have a welcome configuration which has the prefix of welcome for all my properties. So generally what we will do is we will add something called as welcome.message and then add the message in the property file. Now I'm going to delete this property file and I'm going to generate that from Kubernetes. So I'm going to leverage Kubernetes to load those property file. So let's not worry about the property file for now. I also want to print this particular configuration every now and then. So let's create a scheduler. So I will annotate it with component, and this is going to be a scheduler. So I will have to schedule my function. Let's say for every 3 seconds. So this function will be triggered every 3 seconds, and I want to print my configuration which I have. So let's inject the configuration which we created, which is the welcome configuration. So I've created a configuration object and we are going to say config.getMessage because we have a message inside the welcome configuration and we are going to print it. And this is going to be triggered every 3 seconds. Now I want to create a REST endpoint and I want to create a native configuration. For example, instead of using the configuration properties, I want to directly load it using the at value. So let's create welcome controller. This is going to be a REST endpoint. What's fun without creating a REST endpoint in a Spring Boot project, isn't it? I'm going to create an endpoint called welcome. The moment you hit this particular endpoint, it's going to just return me a simple message. And this message, we want to load it from the property file. And I'm going to use the value. Instead of using the same welcome.message, now I'm going to use something called message. So let me use message and I'll have a default message, welcome to TP YouTube. I'll just use a different default message just to show the difference between the message and the welcome.message. So this is basically an endpoint which is using a property called message, and the scheduler component is going to be using the configuration object where it is loading using the configuration properties where it starts with welcome. I'll also go to the welcome controller and add a message here. I'll just add the message so that we can see in the logs. So we are set with the project. So we are now set with the project. This is how you typically design a property based loading inside your project, right? Either you use the at value or you use the configuration properties. Either or the case, you should be able to load these messages into your code. Now, in order to deploy this into the Kubernetes platform, we need this to be converted into a Docker image. So I need a Docker file. So what I will do is I'll create a Docker content. Basically, I want to create a Docker file from this particular Spring Boot application. So let me do a clean build and I want to know what is the jar name. So I'll do a clean install. Whatever I pasted here is basically a default Docker file which I use for most of my experimental projects. In this case, our jar name will have something different. I think it's going to be Spring Cloud Config. Yeah, so we got it here. Spring Cloud Kubernetes Config example with the snapshot version. I'm just copying it from the local into the Docker image in the root path, and also I'm just running it, nothing else. I'm using the base image OpenJDK:8 You can use Alpine as well, which is a lightweight version. Now we are set with the Docker file, but how do we run this Docker file? Either you use the Docker CLI or you can use different plugins. I'm going to use Scaffold. If you had seen my previous video on Scaffold, I have used Scaffold for continuously deploying my application into the Kubernetes environment. So I'm going to use Scaffold here. So inside Scaffold, I have a build section. In the build section, I'm going to give the artifact name, basically the image name. For this example, I'm going to call my deployment as config example. So I'll name my image as well as config example. I have a deployment section where I am saying run the kubectl commands, because once the build is completed and your Docker images are created, you need to deploy these into your Kubernetes environment. So you need the config map, a service, and a deployment. So I'm going to have two YAML files, which is the config YAML and the deployment YAML. So first, let's create the config YAML. So I have a config map live template, which is this. The moment I click on the config map, it generates a code because I saved it beforehand. Nothing fancy here. Note that the name of the config map should be the same as your application name, or else you will have to change the name in your configuration. So I'm going to use the same example name, config-example. I have two different configurations in the application property. One is nothing but my welcome message, and the other one is my message. Hi from app.properties. I've just added some basic message, nothing else. So this is my config map. I need to create a config map with this properties. Obviously, this can have application YAML, you can have key value pairs, and different varieties of these configurations can be added inside your config map. The next one is the deployment YAML. The deployment YAML is going to have the service and the deployment. Obviously, if you're not using Spring Cloud Kubernetes, you can mount your config map into your volume mount and use that volume mounts on your containers. So that way you can load the app.properties directly onto the container and use it from there. But we are not going to use it, so I'll just delete that part. We are just going to create a deployment with one replica. I'll rename my config service to config example. So now that we have renamed all our config examples, I also have the service which is also named as config example. I'm selecting my service for the app selector as app equal to config example, and I'm using the same here. So that's how my labels are getting mapped here. Also, I'm using the service as a node. Since I'm going to use Minikube, which is installed in my laptop, I'm okay with my node port, so I can access my application using that particular port. So both my deployment.yaml and the config YAMLs are set. Also, my scaffold YAML is set. My POMs are all good. I have already built the image. Now I need to add some property files so that my application can understand what needs to be done as a part of the Spring startup. So I'm going to create application YAML. These are some of the properties which I want to add to the application. I need to change this also to config example. I have some management endpoints which are exposing info, refresh, keep alive, and health. Info is obviously going to show the information about the application. Keep alive is going to tell if it is up or not. Same with health. What are the integration points which are failing? There is something called refresh. Refresh is used when you have a config server and you want to refresh your properties inside your application. That's when you enable refresh endpoint and you can directly hit it. So I'll be showing you how to do refresh as well. Apart from adding the application.yaml, we need to also add the bootstrap YAML. Inside the bootstrap YAML, I'm going to add some of the configurations because I wanted some configurations to be used before even Spring gets started. For example, I want to enable Spring Cloud Kubernetes Config and its default namespace and the name of the config map and all those. So I'm saying use config map. I'm using Minikube with the default namespace, so I just use default here. And also this is nothing but the config maps name. Inside the config YAML, we created config-example as the config map, and I'm going to use the same name here. So these are some configurations which are required for enabling Spring Cloud Kubernetes inside the application, and we are adding it into the bootstrap.yaml because Spring needs to know these beforehand when it starts loading the classes into its container. We also need to add the enable scheduling annotation so that our scheduler gets kicked whenever the server comes up. Or else what happens, this schedule method will never get called. So I've added the @enable scheduling annotation into our application. With that, we can just build the application and we should be able to deploy this inside our Kubernetes cluster using scaffold. Inside scaffold, I have configured it to use Dockerfile because I have a Dockerfile. If you have a Jib Maven plugin, you can use that as well. I am showing it with the Dockerfile this time. So my build is completed. So using scaffold run, I can build and then deploy my images inside the Kubernetes platform. So using scaffold build, I can build the image out of the Docker file, and scaffold deploy will deploy that Docker file into the Kubernetes platform using the native kube control. So I'm going to use scaffold run. This is going to build and also deploy. Before that, let's build our artifact once so that we are sure we are deploying the latest image. If you want to get real updates deployed into your cluster, you can use scaffold dev command, but I'm just showing you scaffold run. So let's run the scaffold build. So this will build an image from the jar file whatever we had, and also it will now create the pod inside the minikube. So this is just created 5 seconds ago, and you can see that there is a deployment section which says it has created a config map and the deployment service. Now I can do a kubectl describe config map config hyphen example. Now this will show me what are the different properties which are there inside my config map. So these are the two properties which we have in our config map, and that's what got created. Now to see the logs of the pod, we can do kubectl logs and then the pod name -f. F will be like the streaming logs, and if you notice, these are the logs which are coming from the scheduler component. So the scheduler component is logging every 3 seconds, and we can see those logs. There is also one more component which we created, which is the REST URL. In order to hit that, we can hit our service using the minikube service config -example command. This will create the URL. The font is too big because we wanted to see the message. So we have a message under welcome, and that's nothing but hi from app.properties. And this particular message is specific to the REST endpoint, and it's present inside the config map. And that's how you can use the Kubernetes native config map inside the application without even binding it or using it using volume mounts. You can directly natively use it inside the Spring Boot application. The next part is how do we change it, and then how can we apply this particular change. For example, I'm going to change this to hello YouTube from app.properties. In order to do that, I need to apply my configuration, isn't it? So let the log stream in here, and I'll go to my downloads Spring Cloud project. I need to apply my configuration. So in order to do that, I'll do kubectl apply -f, and I'll apply the config map. So this will change my config map to have the value hello YouTube. But however, if you see, still my application is not printing hello YouTube. This is because we need to manually refresh the configuration using the Actuator endpoint. So in order to do that, I'll do a curl on this particular URL, and there is a URL called actuator/refresh. We have enabled it in the property in the application configuration, actuator/refresh, and then we need to pass an empty message. I also need to have the content type in my header to pass this as a JSON, so I have added it now. And the moment I hit this, my application gets refreshed. Previously it was displaying hello tech primers, and now it is displaying hello YouTube. If you notice, the pod did not get restarted, but just the Spring Boot application loaded its configuration, and the application did not go for a restart. Once it has loaded, it has pasted some of the messages, and these are messages coming from this Spring Cloud Kubernetes configuration. So see that it just said I loaded this particular configuration and I have these properties. As usual, this example will be available in GitHub. You can take it from the GitHub repository and then try it out in your Kubernetes cluster. Either it is Minikube or if it is GCP, doesn't matter. So you should be able to deploy this seamlessly using scaffold into any of these environments from your local. One other thing to note is Spring Boot will use the API server call to directly connect to your API server to get the config maps. So you might need to add the server's account with the role for viewing your config map and the secrets. So you can create a cluster role and bind it to your service account of your namespace, and you should be able to leverage that service account to access from the API server. So Spring Boot will use the API server to do API calls to interact with your config map, and that's why you need the service account to be created. And by default, service account won't have any view access. That is something which you have to keep in mind. In the next video, we will look at how to do service discovery. Now that we have created a client application, we can create a server-side application, which is basically another pod or another deployment, and we can access that from this particular application using the service discovery, which the Kubernetes platform provides out of the box. As usual, if you like the video, go ahead and like it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and subscribe to it. Meet you again in the next video. Thank you very much.